Awesome. I think we can see your screen, Deepak.
Great. Hey everyone. Really nice to give this presentation today on capabilities of inverters for advanced grid support. Thank you for that introduction, Mithil. And as Mithil suggested, please do drop comments, questions in the chat as we go along. Try to keep it the presentation to within around 45 minutes, and then we can have a Q&A and a discussion. So I think a lot of us are pretty familiar with this and the entire basis of what is happening with the power system, where the power system is essentially changing from what is a traditionally synchronous generator dominated power system. So majority of these power systems, at least now until 2-3 years back, a synchronous generator dominated system, if you want to view it from a cartoonish perspective or from a mechanical perspective, can be thought of as this wheel with the wheel blocks put below it in terms of keeping it from moving around. And if you have an inverter-based resource or a distributed energy resource connected to this power system, then any small changes of current that this inverter-based resource injects into the network does not effectively impact the synchronous generator dominated system at all. However, if the synchronous generator dominated system itself moves, and here, of course, we're not talking about mechanical movement, we're talking about electrical movement. If that itself moves, then the inverter-based resource will move along with it. Now, this kind of behavior has been happening since the first time probably inverter-based resources connected, close to around 20 years back. We didn't feel the need for any terminology for it. We didn't feel the need for calling it anything. But off late, and when I say off late, I mean in the past 10 years, it has been labeled as grid following. On the other side, you have an inverter-based resource dominated system. And if you don't do anything else, so if it is the same kind of inverters that we have in a lot of today's systems, if you add that into the power system, then kind of the elasticity of the grid increases. You no longer have those conceptual mechanical blocks to help the movement or prevent the movement of the system. And what ends up happening is any changes in current that these inverter-based resources will inject into the network will actually cause the entire system itself to move around electrically. And when that entire system moves around electrically, then the inverter-based resource will also move around with it. And this kind of a tandem motion that would occur in the electrical sense, where you have a change in current from the inverter-based resource causing the voltages on the power system to move around, and that change in voltage causing the current to again move. That kind of a cause and effect tandem relationship that will occur will potentially lead to some instability issues that can come up. So this kind of interaction, we do want it to be stabilized, because as you have more and more inverter-based resources coming into the network, we want to try to have a more stiff system. We want to try to have more control on the way in which we have our currents being injected into the network. And in order to do that, we do need the inverter-based resources to provide some kind of capability or services into the system. Now that brings up a question. So we spoke about current being injected from the inverter-based resources, and that causing the voltages on the network to move around. And that brings up a question of, is the inverter-based resource a current source? So in order to now dig into that, we need to go back into first principles from a power electronic perspective. From a power electronic perspective, this notion of voltage source converter versus current source converter is pretty much an aspect of the physical structure of the inverter itself. A voltage source inverter is something that has a DC voltage on the DC link. And depending upon how we close these switches, the AC voltage is generated. A current source converter or a current source inverter, on the other hand, is something that has a DC inductor, so current on the DC side. And depending upon how we close these switches, a current gets manifested on the AC side. Now, this aspect of whether it is a current source or a voltage source converter, as I said, is purely from the perspective of the physical structure of the device. And that is something that we have to probably keep in mind as we go through this entire presentation, because one might have come across the aspect or notion quite a bit saying that today's inverters are current sources and we want voltage sources on the network. It's useful to bear in mind that every inverter that we have today on the network, at least on the generation side, is a voltage source. It is a source that generates an AC voltage from a DC voltage. So from the physical structure of the inverter, it is a voltage source, and that is every inverter that's there on the system is a voltage source. So with that, then one has to probably look into as to getting an understanding of, okay, why do we distinguish between a current source and a voltage source, or try to understand the differences between those kind of injections that these devices will provide on the network. In order to do that, now let's take a look at operating principle. So a present day inverter for one of the most conventional kind of control objectives that might be there has two parts to it, the way in which it operates on the network. The first part is decided by the network. So you have Kirchhoff's voltage law and Ohm's law and so on that will always govern how this inverter-based resource acts on the network. Just because we have, or we are moving towards a system that will have a majority of inverter-based resources, that doesn't imply that Kirchhoff's laws will no longer be valid. They will definitely be valid. So every inverter that we have on the network today, its response from the network side perspective is governed by Kirchhoff's voltage law. What that means is that the inverter is a voltage source, as we decide. Every inverter on the system is a voltage source. It develops an internal AC voltage, and the current across or coming out of the inverter across the filters that are there is based upon the voltage difference that exists between the developed voltage and the terminal voltage that is there. Now, this voltage difference between the developed voltage and the terminal voltage results in the actual flow of current out of the inverter. So now, if a disturbance happens on the network, the terminal voltage will change, and that will then govern how the entire current is coming out from the inverter. On the other side, you have the entire controller that is there. So the controller for the inverter will, in most of the conventional cases, and there are some cases where, or some of the newer architectures which will not have this, but in most of the conventional architecture, where an individual inverter, and note here, we're talking about an individual inverter. We're not talking about an entire plant. An individual inverter has power commands that are given to it, and the individual inverter's control determines that for that power command that it is asked to inject into the network, how much should the current be that it has to inject at the voltage that it is injecting it at. So the inverter control is trying to ensure that this power that is being injected into the network is the same as the power reference that it has. And in order to do that, it has to generate a current reference, and that it has to generate that current reference such that the current that is drawn out by the network from the inverter is the same as the current reference. So all throughout, to a certain extent, the network is still the boss, so to speak, in terms of determining how much current gets drawn out from the inverter. And that is going to be true for every kind of inverter-based resource that we have in the system. So now let's say a disturbance occurs. So if a disturbance occurs on the grid where the terminal voltage changes, then if everything else remains the same on this side, then in order to keep this current the same as the current reference, the inverter controls should ensure that the that is developed at the terminal changes rapidly. And if it does that, then for this new voltage that is there on the grid, the new voltage that is developed on the inverter will then ensure that the current that is drawn out by the network from the inverter is the same as the current reference. So the inverter is developing a voltage. The voltage source of the inverter is developing a voltage in order to ensure that the current is meeting the current reference, which is governed by the active and reactive power reference that it needs to inject into the network. And in order to ensure that this voltage changes fast, the inverter controls needs to estimate the angle of the grid fast, and it needs to ensure that there is a fast enough current control loop that can help change this internal voltage. If it doesn't do that, hence that if this voltage doesn't change fast, then what would end up getting is that this voltage is not changing fast, which means that when a disturbance occurs on the grid and the grid side voltage changes, the inverter internal voltage remains unchanged or changes slowly, and one will result in having a mismatch in the current between the current that is being drawn out from the inverter and the current reference that is determined by the controls. That can have beneficial impacts to the system, so we'll talk about that a little bit later. But at the end of the day, what a lot of conventional inverter-based resources do is they change this internal voltage that is generated in a fast manner such that the current that is drawn out by the network from the inverter is the same as the current reference. Now, let's go to the plant level. So that was the operating principle of an individual inverter within the plant. So this individual inverter within the plant, from its perspective of its terminals, that's how it operates. The plant level controller in majority of the inverter-based resources that we have today, the plant level controller is responsible for providing or for controlling frequency, for providing frequency response, for providing voltage control at the plant control level. But all of that happens on a slower time scale. And as we come down to the inverter level, you have controls that activate on or act on a much faster time scale and have different layers embedded within them. So depending upon where on this hierarchy of control we have different services being provided by the inverter-based resource, it will have different impacts that are there on the system. Now, what this also means is that this has an aspect associated with different levels of stability that will be manifested on the network side, depending upon the type of services that are provided, the layer at which the service is provided, the hierarchy of control at which the service is provided. If we keep just the inverter again in context, we spoke about the inverter on the previous slide. We spoke about how the inverter is having that power reference command and so on, that needs to provide injection of current into the network. So if we keep the inverter itself in context again, then there are three major families of control objectives that can be manifested. We have on the extreme left, we have a family of control where AC voltage is developed by the inverter in order to inject or absorb power. And for grid events that occur, so when the grid voltage changes, then the inverter's developed AC voltage changes quickly so as to retain the pre-event injection or absorption of power. So few of the words here are very key in terms of the developed voltage changing quickly and retaining the pre-event injection of power. Those are the two key terms that are there. On the other side of the spectrum, you have inverter control system that again develops an AC voltage, but now develops the AC voltage to try to control the magnitude and the frequency of that developed AC voltage. And when there are grid events occurring, that developed AC voltage changes slowly. And when that developed AC voltage changes slowly, when there are grid events occurring, the current becomes a little bit more flexible in terms of its injection into the network. So as we move from left to right, we have an increasing amount of grid friendliness or support that comes in. And as we move from right to left, we have an increasing amount of bandwidth or tightness of control. Now, if you want to think about this a little bit further, the way to think about it, and we'll talk about this extreme left again. The way to think about it is think about it from the perspective of a power flow solution. So power flow solutions, when we solve power flow, we know that there are three kinds of buses that we use. We have a PQ bus where we have P and Q known, and we keep those P and Q values as constant from the perspective of the power flow solution. And we have a slack bus where voltage and angle is kept constant. And we have a PV bus where active power and voltage are kept constant. So let's think about the PQ bus and the slack bus. If you have a power flow solution where all of the buses or a majority amount of the buses in that power flow solution are PQ buses, and you have a contingency occurring in the system, then it's more than likely that that power flow solution will not converge when you apply that contingency, because the P and Q injection is kept constant at all of the other buses. And even if there is a slack bus, right, there's different likelihoods that voltage will collapse. There's different likelihoods that the angle swings will be too much, and so on. So if you have a majority of buses in your power flow solution as PQ buses, then when you apply a contingency event, let's say a line outage, it's more than likely that that power flow solution will not converge. On the other hand, if you have a majority of the buses as slack buses and not the theoretical ideal slack bus where only one slack bus is there, but as we do power flow solution and as we learn of power flow solution techniques, there's the concept of a distributed slack bus. So if you have more and more buses that are in that distributed slack bus set, then when you apply a contingency, the likelihood that the power flow solution converges is going to be very high. That is the same principle that applies on the dynamic realm in the time domain realm when we're looking at these different inverter control objectives. What you have on the left is the time domain representation or the time domain equivalent of what will be a PQ bus. And what you have on the right is the time domain or dynamic representation of what would be a distributed slack bus. And the distributed slack bus concept is going to be much more stable. The PQ bus concept is going to be much less stable or much less robust for events that occur in the system. That concept helps set the stage for what is advanced grid support or grid forming, and what do we want from these inverter-based resources as we go further along in our journey with adding inverter-based resources to the system. Let's go back again to this hierarchy of controls, just now viewing it from a different perspective. An inverter-based resource, we have what's known as a first layer of control, where you have the power electronic switches and maybe even some fast current control loops that are there. You have a second layer of control, which is still at the inverter level. And this is in charge of the active power, reactive power, and so on. And then you have a plant controller that takes care of some of the frequency response, voltage response at the entire plant level. Now, this region here, where this time scale or this bandwidth of control that we have, depending upon what is the control objective in this region of control, is usually what determines whether there is a notion of grid forming or advanced grid support or not in an inverter. So if we take that further, then if an inverter in the subtransient and the transient time scale if it prioritizes the injection of current in order to meet the injection of active and reactive power, then we can call it non-grid forming. On the other hand, if it prioritizes the injection of current in order to meet voltage and frequency, then we can call it grid forming. Now note here that very intentionally, we have not used the words current source or voltage source, because if you take a look at any conventional inverter, which is sitting on today's power system, and you apply a voltage step or a frequency step event to it, you'll find that actually the current increases. So it is injecting more current into the network. It's not that the current is kept constant. It's not that the current is kept at the pre-disturbance value. If you actually look at the inverter's response, you will see that the current is increasing. The challenge, though, is the manner in which that current increases, or the objective with which that current increases. So if you have a resource that tries to meet fixed amount of P and Q, and you have a voltage step event or a frequency step event or a phase jump for that matter that occurs on the grid side, then although the current might increase, the manner in which, or the objective with which that current is increasing, is to keep the fixed amount of P and Q being injected into the network, which goes back to our PQ bus that we had spoken about, which goes back to the aspect of that even though the AC voltage of the inverter is being developed in order to increase the current that is being injected, but it is doing so in order to keep P and Q constant. That part is what results in a reduced stability profile that we have in the network. What is also important in this entire setup is it's important that both on the subtransient scale and the transient time scale, this behavior is prioritized as it's mentioned in the table. Now we say that because there were a couple of instances where we saw examples where the inverter prioritized the current injection in order to meet voltage and frequency in the subtransient time scale, but in the transient time scale, it started prioritizing P and Q again. So what this means is in the first few cycles after disturbance, it is helping the grid by prioritizing voltage and frequency. But immediately after those few cycles got over, it started going back to the pre-disturbance value of power, which doesn't help the grid at all. So it's important that both the subtransient and the transient time scale are what is prioritized in terms of meeting the voltage and frequency control. So if you want to really tag a grid forming or an advanced grid support resource and all the functionality that we would want from it, it pretty much falls under this diagram that is there. We want to talk more about the performance capability. We want to talk more about the performance requirements. We want to talk more about the different kinds of services that we can get from these resources. And we'll talk more about the services in the part 2 webinar that is going to be in a month from now, where we'll dig into these individual services and we'll look at it from a service perspective. But essentially, we want these inverters to have this variety of services. So then the question comes is, how do we determine how much of a service is needed? Where is that service needed in the network? Is the inverter capable of providing that service? Do we really need to have a design criteria for the service and so on? All of that, or in order to do all of that analysis, is where we need to look at modeling of these resources. And being able to model these resources from a simulation perspective can really help provide more insight into the kind of services that we want these resources to provide. So when we talk about modeling, there is both RMS and positive sequence modeling and EMT domain modeling. So to model this kind of service-based grid forming, advanced grid support capability, there are some positive sequence generic models that are already available. They're called as the first generation models. They're shown here on the slide. And what they do is they provide initial visibility into how these different devices, different OEMs, how they are actually bringing forth this functionality to provide varying levels of services. But that's not all. That's not all that the types of models are available, because different jurisdictions around the world have different performance requirements. And different jurisdictions around the world have asked for different capabilities from these inverter-based resources. So there are an additional set of models available at the link at the bottom of the slide that talk about some of the additional functionality, or that have representation of some of the additional functionality that are asked for in the various parts of the world. For example, some of the rate of change of voltage based functionality that they were asked for, or better kind of current limiting, different kinds of robust current limiting techniques and methods are something that is asked for in other parts of the world, that these models that I've talked about in this slide have provide visibility into. The third set of models that are available are EMT domain models. These EMT domain models are available for doing a level of generalization studies that can be used to get an understanding of how these advanced grid support services may play a role with the protection equipment on the system, may play a role with some amount of controller interactions that might occur, or might even play a role with respect to, say, some torsional interactions that might occur on the network. So these more detailed models, the EMT domain models, are available from the perspective of getting an understanding of how these resources would operate on a smaller time scale across a frequency spectrum, across a wide frequency spectrum that might exist. Now, the reason why battery energy storage and eStatCom are highlighted here in these slides for the EMT domain model is that at the moment, those are the main two technology that is available in the marketplace for grid forming or advanced grid support. That doesn't mean that wind or PV OEMs are not working on prototypes or working on this kind of functionality. A lot of it may still be R&D, but the battery and the eStatCom technology are the two main that are available on the market for standalone resources. For point-to-point resources like HVDC, that is also available, and those models are also available. So if anybody wants to play around with a point-to-point HVDC model for doing some kind of a grid forming or advanced grid support capability, feel free to reach out to me and I'll be happy to point you to that model that exists for that. So these three types of models that exist, or these three families of models that exist, have then been used for carrying out few application studies to get an understanding of where exactly advanced grid support or grid forming is needed, what is the sizing of the support that is needed, how much of overcurrent capability is needed, and so on. So I'll briefly touch upon that, about some of those application studies. But before going forward, I told you, right, that there are different regions around the world that have different requirements, that have varying requirements. There's still some amount of core functionality that is common, but there are some additional functionality that is unique to each individual region. And this slide gives a brief overview of where and how these requirements are being framed. This slide is a little bit dated. It is from late last year, earlier this year, and we are in the process of actually preparing a new version of this slide because the German requirement is now already available. It's no longer in draft. And SOE requirement is also already available and no longer in draft. And there are a couple of more that we need to add to this particular slide deck. But largely, what ends up happening with each of these requirements is that there is a country-specific set of requirements that are usually developed or incorporated to cater to some of the nuances that might be there within that particular footprint or particular power system. And different regions around the world are adopting grid forming technology at different paces or at different speeds. There are some of the larger networks are still at the evaluation stage. Some of the smaller networks are, of course, already in the stage where they have been operational. They have devices on the network that are actually functional already. And this is, again, something that needs to be updated as we keep going along in this process. But when it comes to standardization of these various resources, one of the things that we have been talking about in the industry is looking at different tiers of grid forming capability. And the reason for doing this, looking at different tiers of grid forming or advanced grid support capability, is because different pieces of equipment provide different functionality. So for example, a STATCOM might provide grid forming functionality only on the voltage support category. An eSTATCOM might be able to provide some amount of frequency support or limited islanding functionality. A battery energy storage system able to provide more amount of extended islanding capability. And black start by itself is a whole nuanced area on its own, even with grid forming advanced grid support. So having these 4 tiers actually enables a more suitable characterization of the various technology, enables a more suitable aspect of actually evaluating technology on an apples to apples basis, and being able to get an understanding of whether these technology are providing the necessary capability or services or not. And there are core functionality that is common in this space across the globe. And there are some additional functionality, especially related to negative sequence, related to harmonic, islanding, and black start, that are not necessarily common across the various systems that are there, but are more niche applications that are coming up. So last section of my presentation will talk a little bit about some of the application studies that have been done to get an assessment and how to use these models, how to help improve the standardization, how to help inform the entire analysis of application of these technology across the system. The first study that I'll talk about a little bit is a study that we did to get an understanding of how much overcurrent capability is needed from these grid forming advanced grid support resources in the network. Now, the reason for looking at this in this particular manner was that there are a few OEMs with this advanced grid support technology that can actually provide a brief amount of high overcurrent, and then they bring it down to close to the nominal value. So say, for example, providing 1.5 pu current for around 2 cycles, and then bringing it down to 1.05 pu. All of it comes at a cost, of course, but there is this aspect of having different levels of current functionality or overcurrent capability that is there. And the system operator with whom we worked with here wanted to evaluate how do they really get an understanding of how much of this overcurrent capability they might require in their system, and how to really have the design specs generated that can ask the OEM to provide this level of overcurrent capability. So we did an entire evaluation across the network with the models that I had spoken about to get an understanding of what is a diminishing level of return, how much is the additional MVA of capability that is required across the network, and is there really a difference between having 2.5 pu transient and 2 pu steady state versus 3 pu transient and 2.5 steady state, and so on. The other network that we did an evaluation for was to get an understanding of across a 24-hour period, when load changes occur, when load fluctuations occur, how do we ensure that the resource is across the network are sized appropriately. So for example, you might have low loading conditions, say sometime at 3 a.m. in the morning, and then load picks up maybe around 8 a.m. in the morning, load drops back again at around noon or 1 p.m., and then load picks up again at 6 p.m. in the evening. So across these varying loading conditions, the question was that, okay, across this 24-hour period, if you had a bunch of loading conditions that were there, then how do we size the level of grid forming or advanced grid support? Where do we locate it on the network? And then how do we size it and get an understanding of stability of the resource? So we use the models that I've spoken about. We have some analysis techniques that we have here at EPRI to basically look into where to locate the resources for this advanced grid support, where to place them, where to size them, and so on, such that across the entire 24-hour period that exists, one actually gets a stable response. Last study that I'll talk about today was a study that we did in the region of North America. And the idea was that there is a smaller portion of the larger network that upon the occurrence of a fault actually has a delayed voltage recovery and has some amount of issues in large signal voltage stability that would happen. So the idea was that if we are to place a new inverter-based resource, then to determine where on this entire network portion should the new inverter-based resource be placed. And in addition to identifying where it should be placed, to get an idea of what should be the size of the inverter-based resource that has been placed. So we looked at different kinds of faults, we looked at different responses that exist to essentially get an understanding of where should it be placed, what size should be there, and how do we mitigate the slow voltage recovery that exists with these resources in this particular region and essentially get a stable response in the network. So that was again with the system operator in the particular location, the footprint. So here at EPRI, we have a lot of other wide variety of work that is going on in this particular space. If any of you all wanted to collaborate, reach out, feel free to reach out to me. We have a lot of work going on in model development. We have a lot of work going on in trying to identify different kinds of capabilities, different kinds of applicability of the model, developing methods and techniques to get an understanding of when to use a particular model, when to really look at whether there is this grid forming advanced grid support capability or not. Looking at characterization in the lab that we have. So how exactly is the resource behaving under various conditions? Is the model matching the performance of the resource as we identified from testing or not? And looking at different kinds of stabilization characteristics of the controls of these different resources. We also have then study work associated with transmission side and distribution side. And we have a lot of engagement in standard and verification. For those of you who may not be aware, there is a standardization effort, IEEE 2800.1, which is basically looking at standardizing the performance requirements for grid forming advanced grid support capability and trying to get an understanding of how these resources may want to behave or how they should behave as we connect more and more on the network. And a lot of that I'll also touch upon in the part 2 of the webinar that will go on different services, looking at different capabilities that exist, looking at different impacts of those services that are there on the network, and how to assess the potential benefit that might come about. With that, I saw questions were popping up, so we probably have around 15 minutes to cater to questions.
Yeah, thank you, Deepak. It was really insightful presentation. Appreciate you, spending some time with us. So we, as you suggested, we do have, a couple of questions in chat box. I will go through each of them. The first question we have from Masood. He's asking that what factors impact the speed of voltage reference of the inverter creation?
Yeah, so there are different factors that have an impact with respect to the speed of voltage creation. Some of it is just bandwidth of the control. So for example, if you have a lot of high bandwidth control, wherein you have very fast control that is trying to ensure that the rise time or response time is very low of the particular controlled variable, then those control loops will have an impact on the speed with which that voltage changes. But sometimes it's also reflective with respect to what the network is doing. If you have a very large impedance on the network side, then what ends up happening is that the voltage at the point of connection of the network becomes very sensitive to change in current injection. And what that means is that slight changes in that current injection will cause large changes in that voltage. And as a result of having that large changes in the voltage, the internally developed voltage that the inverter might be trying to achieve may still take some more time to settle down. So even though the control loop might be high bandwidth and low time response, so to speak, it may not always be capable of ensuring that that developed voltage settles down, because to a certain extent it is also dependent upon the grid side sensitivity that exists.
Okay, I hope Masood, that answers your question. Feel free to put follow-up in case needed. The second question we have, that is from Zahid. He is asking that non-grid forming was not marked as grid following nature. Is it because the inverter is still behaving as current source inverter to control P and Q?
So again, I think there's a reason why we didn't really look at current source, because as I said, every particular inverter is a voltage source inverter. Now, the reason why we marked it as non-grid forming rather than grid following is that there is a wide variety of inverter control that exists, and just having two terminology or two terms to really categorize the inverter controls that exist might be a little bit oversimplification of the complexity that exists in controls. So we call it non-grid forming because the controlling that P and Q of that inverter can manifest in various forms. It can be different levels of delay. It can be different ways in which that P and Q is controlled. And as a result, having one label or one terminology for it can sometimes be a little bit misleading. So that's why we pretty much categorize it as non-grid forming rather than grid forming.
Okay. I also put, a few questions of my own in chat box. I will come to those later. First, we have, the question from Pawan. Pawan is asking, what would be the fastest response time? What would be the fastest response from these grid forming inverters can be? Mainly looking at the capabilities of these to address the large load variations caused by AI data centers.
So, and that's looking at now some of the ongoing research work that is there, is that to really assess whether the grid forming technology is effective or not in mitigating some of these large load based variations is something that's ongoing, because the way in which grid forming technology works is that it is meant to respond towards grid side events, but respond from the perspective of trying to have a more natural, uh, a more grid friendly kind of a support or a response, which means that if the load suddenly increases on the grid, then to deliver more power to the network. If the load suddenly decreases, then to absorb some power. But there are time constants there associated with this that will govern the response. Now, when you have large load variations, where if you have a lot of cycling in that large load, where it is going to be moving up and down at a slightly higher frequency, then it is possible sometimes, and this is still preliminary research work, but it is possible sometimes that grid forming may not be the best technology to actually try to mitigate that large load fluctuation. Because the frequency at which that large load fluctuation is happening, it may not be the one which is able to actually smoothen out or flatten out the profile.
Okay. Yeah, I think Pawan received your answer. Now, coming to a couple of questions from my end, Deepak, I have total 3 questions for you, quite basic ones. So starting with the first one, um, how do we identify that a specific inverter is prioritizing V and F during subtransient and transient phase? Is it possible for you to shed some light on how this functionality is achieved on software or hardware side? Is there any specific component we should be looking at for this feature?
Yeah, so there are ways and tests that can be used to evaluate whether it is prioritizing voltage or frequency control or active power or reactive power control. These tests are both in time domain and in frequency domain. The frequency domain tests may sometimes give a better or a more comprehensive picture with respect to how these resources are behaving, because they will give an insight into different disturbance frequencies that are there, which will cover both subtransit and transient. So if you actually look at the Unify specifications version 3 that was released earlier this year, we've actually identified certain thresholds and certain test criteria that can help determine whether this voltage frequency control is being provided or it's active power frequency control that's being provided. So you essentially look at a variety of transfer functions across the frequency spectrum profile. And if the transfer function is within a certain magnitude or within a certain phase angle bound, you can actually make a conclusion as to whether it is providing this kind of capability or not. Now, whether it's a particular hardware element or whether a particular software element that is causing this change or causing this behavior, it completely depends upon OEM to OEM. There are some OEMs who would add just from a software perspective a change, but depending upon whether you go into non-battery technology, say something like wind technology, then there might be a need for some hardware changes also that are necessary in order to bring about some of this change in control philosophy. I think there was one more sub part, right?
Yeah, I think the last one was the specific component, and I believe you answered,
Yeah.
I think you touched upon, yeah, that. So, yeah, it should be fine. Just a one quick follow-up here, Deepak, which is on the frequency scan side of things. Do you see that, or so I'm not familiar with, how to perform that, but is there any commercially available software which could, do that kind of scan?
There are a variety of different software from different both like within commercial tools and wrapper tools that are available that do this scan. So there are a variety of such tools available nowadays.
Okay, understood. So, second one is related to your that case study which you shared, where I think the sizing of inverter was done. So I'll just read out the actual question. Could you please provide some more insights on sizing of GFM as per the case study presented? What kind of studies were undertaken to meet the requirements of bulk power services?
Yeah, so that
Right.
that sizing that was conducted, the sizing of GFM case study that was conducted there was primarily from the perspective of trying to size the inverter to ensure that system strength and stability services were being provided. It was not from the perspective of trying to assume or ensure frequency response or active power reserve headroom or anything like that. Those would be additional aspects that actually have to be considered when doing a sizing. In that particular case study that was done, there was enough of active power reserve resources that were available across the network. So the main sizing that was done was to look at voltage strength and stability across the various loading profiles.
Okay, understood. And just a one follow-up on that, all of these assessment were they carried out on EMT side of things or in let's say RMS or any other domain?
So it's a mix of both, depending upon the type of analysis to be done, and that's where the models come into play for getting an understanding
Sure.
of the limitations of each of those models. So, for example, if you're looking at more of a stability and across a different set of or a wide range of frequency spectrum, then the EMT domain becomes more important. But if you're looking more at from the perspective of frequency response or those kind of analysis, or even to a certain extent, just some of the lower frequency inter-area modes or so on, then RMS domain is more than sufficient. So in the analysis that was done, it's a variety of doing both RMS domain and EMT domain, just depending upon the focus of each study.
Understood. Do you recommend any research article to understand this kind of, definitely not the EPRI side. If it is available publicly, yeah, I would love to take a look. But if any other research article or anything you would recommend to understand this process in detail?
So there's probably not one research article. There are probably many research articles. I would say that some of the recent IEEE Power and Energy magazine articles that have come out have a good overview of some of these topics and provide more pointers towards deeper dive articles.
Sure. I think I can reach out to you separately to gain, understanding that which one would be more applicable here. So yeah, thank you. Thank you, Deepak. Appreciate it. I think we have another question from Jovin, and he's asking that is there a typical kilowatt or megawatt range where the industry starts preferring grid farming over grid following inverters? For example, are smaller load displacement or net metered projects generally grid following, while larger utility scale TER and storage projects are moving toward grid farming controls? What factors drive that transition in practice?
Yeah, so there's no real standardization in that sizing, because it comes down to the individual resource, the individual system. It also comes down to the services that each of the resources are providing. And in fact, this is probably a good pointer towards the part 2 webinar that we will be having, which will look at, as you have different inverters in the system providing different levels of services, the megawatt, the percentage of this grid farming that is required actually changes. So you can go anywhere from saying that you need 50% of the resources to be grid farming to going down to a number saying maybe only 5% needs to be grid farming, because it all depends upon how much capability and services we get from the other resources in the network, which is also a reason why having that one tag that says that all the other resources are grid following sort of falls apart, because you can have a scenario where you can have a system, like if you use that analogy where there is only one word of grid following to describe all of the other inverters in the system, you can have a scenario where you can say that, oh, system A can have 50% grid farming and 50% grid following, and system B can have 95% grid following and 5% grid farming. But the grid following characteristics in the 95% grid following system in system B is going to be very different from the grid following characteristics in the system A that has 50% grid following. So having that one terminology kind of breaks down there, because it's very much dependent upon the different levels of services that each resource provides.
Understood. I think Jovin got the answer. And lastly, Deepak, I have just one more question that is more on the definition side of grid farming inverters or advanced grid support. So is it possible for you to, share some insight on the, different kind of approach taken uh, on, defining grid farming inverters in European countries, and comparatively to what we are currently researching in North America? And a follow-up would be that which one you find more realistic, or kind of a, a significant step forward?
So I don't think there's anything like with anything being more realistic or a significant step, because largely all of those definitions or all of those approaches are are largely aligned and largely similar. Any kind of definition that adopts a performance-based approach and a performance-based requirement rather than a specific control architecture or a specific control structure definition. I think the performance-based requirements are more appropriate than a definition that is based upon a control architecture.
Understood. Thank you. Meanwhile, I was asking my question. I guess we have one more question, Deepak, for you. That's from Savitri, and she's asking that, does a grid forming inverter respond differently to faults than a non-grid forming inverter? Is it acceptable to represent its built-in protection mechanisms in the simulation model?
Yeah, so response of forming to faults is at the moment non-standardized. So in contrast, non-grid forming, the response to faults, especially with IEEE 2800 coming out, there's a semblance of standardization that is there. Non-grid forming, grid forming right now, there's no real standard behavior to faults that exist. And as a result, what ends up happening is the behavior can be quite different because it depends upon the current limiting method they would have. It depends upon, for unbalanced faults, how they are controlling negative sequence current and what kind of negative sequence current injections they have into the network. It also depends upon how quickly they're controlling the current towards the limit and what do they do when the current hits the limit. So standardization with respect to grid forming fault right through behavior is one of the tasks that is going on in IEEE 2800.1 to help try to bring about some consensus with respect to how we want grid forming inverters to behave during faults.
All right, I think we got a really good answer from you, I guess, Deepak. So with this, I think we are at the end of all our questions. So Deepak, I think there was one more query, a kind of a more like a general question in chat box that will you be able to share the presentation slides which you used today?
Yeah, I can share it with you and you can upload it to the IEEE vTools link, and then anybody who wants to download it from vTools can download it.
Sounds good then. So I guess that was a question from Masood, and yeah, I think we will be able to, I think, yeah, Zahid. Yeah, we will be able to share the slides, and yeah. So after this webinar, we will reach out to all the attendees or all the registration, registered participants with the presentation slide deck and I would say the recording as well. So with this, I think we are coming to an end to our technical talk today. So I would really like to thank you, Deepak, for, taking some time today and, sharing really meaningful knowledge, today on grid forming technology. We look forward to, hosting you in next session somewhere around in August. Participants, please, keep an eye out for that announcement from our end. And lastly, one more piece of notification would be that those who have, registered for IEEE PDH certificate, they will be receiving, a short feedback form from our end. Please fill that and, send the filled form back to me. And we will be able to, issue your certificates. So I'll just stop the recording now and